Okay, we're going to be dealing with worldview today, and as typically, we are beginning with the picture of an archer aiming at a target, and the bullseye being the good, the right, the ought, according to which system we're using. So the midterm is going to be coming up this Thursday, and you have to take it somewhere between Thursday and Saturday, 11:59 p.m. Midterm study notes are still available to you if you did not make use of them until now, but the time for asking questions, not questions about the test itself, questions about the content and about ideas and concepts in the content, is now past. All right. So this is the flow chart that we're going to work with for the rest of the semester, and it is the idea that on the left are ethics of conduct, principles that say what should I do, whereas on the right is the principle of character. Who should I be, or what sort of a woman, what sort of a man should I be? And so the ethics of conduct begin with utilitarianism, and that being the idea that we are looking for the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and that's Bentham and Mills. It's defined by Bentham in terms of pleasure primarily, and Mills in terms of happiness primarily. And we know that those are both forms of hedonism that correspond to the ancient philosophers Aristippus and Epicurus. Then when we're dealing with deontology, so utilitarianism looks past the action, not what should I do, but what will the outcome be. We're dealing with deontology, it's saying what should I do in terms of what I'm responsible to do. It's based on the root word for duty, deon, in Greek. So it's the study of duty. And this is Immanuel Kant. And it is configured in terms of having a good will. That's the out of the starting gate what one has to have in order to be an ethical man or woman. And then using the two categorical imperatives, the first one being act according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it could become a universal law. And the second one, oftentimes called the practical imperative, is always treat humanity, whether in yourself or in the person of another, as an end in itself and never as a means only. So those both are saying, what should I do? One saying outcomes, one saying what's my duty, what is owed. And now over here, as we look over to the right, this is saying, whom should I be in this situation? So this is ethics of character, or virtue ethics, and harkens all the way back to Aristotle and the woman who revived Aristotle for the contemporary world, Elizabeth Anscombe. So we're going to continuously look at them and at the way that they reason, because that's how you're going to do your final exam, is using these theories. Your reading for this week was Ali Gray's short article in the Journal of International Psychiatry from August 2011 on worldviews and about treatment conflicts that oftentimes occur in the medical profession when we have people who are being treated who have one worldview, or their loved one is being treated who have one worldview, and the medical establishment has another worldview. It does create conflicts. It's a good reading and good responses to it. And so this morning, what we're dealing with is the idea of Weltanschauung, is the way that Weltanschauung is a term that belongs to Immanuel Kant, and it is the term belongs to Kant, but of course the idea is probably as old as human beings. We feel a need to make sense out of our world. As a human being, we feel this need to make sense of our world. Our brains are always trying to impose meaning on what we see. One point in time, I was going down the Sebasticook River to a place that is quite wide in that river with our children when we first moved to Maine. And in my mind, moose were only to be found way out in the willywags. You had to go way north up into the back country in order to see moose. And so I didn't think there were any near our home in Pittsfield, Maine. And as I'm going up the river, I come around a bend and there's what looks like a moose ahead of me, but my mind says there aren't moose around here. So I thought, well, it must be a tree that fell over, and the root system looks like a moose's antlers because we were looking from a distance. But right around that moose, right nearby to it, there were some ducks, geese swimming. And so I said to my younger daughter and son, I said to them, look guys, look at the geese and the ducks up there. And both of them turned to me like there was something wrong with me and said, Daddy, what about the moose? Because it was very obviously there was a moose there. But the reason why I wasn't thinking there was a moose there was because my brain, your brain, is always trying to make sense of what it sees. This is from Samuel Huntington, famous political scientist who taught at Harvard for many years, and from his book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. I'm not going to go through the whole quote. He says here, peoples and nations are attempting to answer the most basic questions humans can face. Who are we? And they're answering that question in the traditional way human beings have answered it, by reference to the things that mean most to them. And then he gives you a whole catalog of all those things. Look at how it ends, the last sentence. We know who we are only when we know who we are not, and often only when we know whom we are against. So the process of doing worldview is knowing who we are and how we stand in the world as over against other views of life. So this is the concept of worldview, and it's, I think, very important in the world of ethics, because if we're going to work together, and if I'm going to have empathy for you, I need to try to be able to put myself in your shoes, and vice versa. You put yourself in my shoes, so that we can see the world through each other's eyes. Why does he or she interpret things that way? Why do they hold that view? And we don't want to just think of other people as being odd, so we're trying to understand why do they hold that view. Paul Hebert is famous anthropologist. He said, a worldview can be expressed as the fundamental cognitive, affective, and evaluative presuppositions a group of people make about the nature of things in which they use to order their lives. And this is Dr. Arthur Holmes, for many years the head of the philosophy department at Wheaton College. He says, what is it that ties everything together, matter and mind, life and death, art and science, faith and learning, and makes this a universe, a universe? That seems to be what human beings need to know. What can unify our vision of life? To see things interrelated as a whole is to get one's bearings on the map of life, to know one's way in the confusing interplay of ideas, to find relatedness in what we do. He's speaking of worldview. And this is William Alston, who was a professor for many years at the University of Syracuse, and before that he was at Rutgers University. He says it can be argued on the basis of facts concerning the nature of man, by that he means human beings, and of human life, that human beings have a deep-seated need to form some general picture of the total universe in which they live, in order to be able to relate their own fragmentary activities to the universe as a whole in a way meaningful to them, and that a life in which this is not carried through is a life impoverished in a most significant respect. And for me, the man who was my first philosophy professor and who indicated to me that I should become a philosopher is Dr. Ronald Nash. And in his book, in Worldviews in Conflict, called Worldviews in Conflict, he says this: a worldview is a set of beliefs about the most important issues in life. I like that definition because it's so short and yet it says it. So this is, I'm going to be using his grid for worldview as I approach this. So he was for many years the chairman of the Department of Philosophy and Religion and director of graduate studies in humanities at Western Kentucky University. He's one of my very favorite philosophers. So it's a pentagon that he uses, the worldview grid, and on one side is theology, or God. So atheists have a theology. Their theology is that there is no God. Buddhism is a non-theistic religion. There is not a God in Buddhism. That's a theology, that it's non-theistic. Metaphysics is by that we mean ultimate reality. We'll talk about that a little bit further. Ethics, I'm going to just leave ethics in the same terminology. We could say moral philosophy if you wanted, but just ethics here. And then epistemology, it's the study of how do we know, what are our sources of knowledge, what are valid ways of knowing. And then lastly, anthropology. So we're going to look at each of those 5 aspects of a worldview. Other ways you could say this is God, ultimate reality, ethics still, knowledge, and then human beings, because that's what anthropology is, the study of human beings. Okay, so first of all, knowledge. How do we know what we know? Is significant knowledge about your world really possible? I don't mean by that, some of you have a philosophy background perhaps, I don't mean to engage the issue of idealism and all of that, but are our senses trustworthy? So you know that your senses give you a slice of reality, but I think you all know that they don't give you all of reality. While you're sitting here listening to this, neutrinos are passing through your body and through the table or chair that you're sitting at and on. But you don't see any neutrinos. There are ultra-high frequency sounds in the room with you, and there's also low frequency subsonic sounds in the room. There are spectrums of light that you cannot see. And so your senses give you a certain bit of reality, but they don't give you all of reality. So is significant knowledge about your world really possible? Do our senses give us enough for us to have significant knowledge about our world? Well, if you didn't believe that, you certainly wouldn't be pursuing anything in the sciences. Can we trust our senses? Sometimes your senses interpret things differently than how they actually are. It'll have to do oftentimes with the very nature of human perception. Maybe you've seen a wheel on a vehicle going by, that the vehicle was moving forward, but it looked like the wheels were moving backwards because of the nature of the spokes and where they were set. And that has to do with the rods and the cones in your eyes. We know that sound is not actually the way that we hear it. We use a term in order to describe the Doppler effect as far as how we hear sound of an approaching vehicle and then when it passes. What's the relationship between reason or rationality and experience? So reason, rationality, same thing, and then experience. And that's the question of empiricism versus rationalism. For the rationalist, he or she believes that they have knowledge that didn't just come through their senses, that they kind of came pre-programmed into this world with certain categories in their mind and certain a priori knowledge before sense experience. But for the empiricist, he or she says there is nothing in the mind that wasn't first in the senses. It's the concept of us being a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, when we come into this life, and everything being written on us by sense experience. Which one of these two things is more important to you, and which holds greater weight in your mind? Your intuitions about the way things are, or your tangible perception of the external world? In the Myers-Briggs temperament analysis, this would come under the category of intuition or intuiting versus sensing. For those who it's got to be the tangible perception of the external world, they are oftentimes guarded about and dubious of their intuitions. Where for those who are very focused on their intuitions and trust them very highly, they sometimes will trust their intuitions over what they can see as far as visible evidence. Going on from there, is truth relative? Now, we've dealt with cultural relativism in this class, and what I put forward to you is the notion that at the micro level, indeed it is, it can't help but be, but at the macro level, it's not as different as it may appear upon a simple glance at first. But is truth relative? Is there such a thing as absolute truth? And if you say no, that there's no absolute truth, are you absolutely sure? What is the relationship between religious faith and reason? There are those who would say there's no relationship. In fact, to be religious in any way, shape, or form means that you have to be irrational. Richard Dawkins, formerly the professor of public understanding of science at Oxford University, has had the habit of calling people who believe in God faith heads. And he compares to their belief in God to a belief in a flying spaghetti monster on the bottom of the sea. Well, is faith really that laughable? Or is there perhaps some relationship between religious faith and reason, at least in some people's minds and lives? And interestingly, about 40% of research scientists in the hard sciences are, at the present time, people of faith. So it doesn't seem like necessarily that religious faith entails irrational thought. If there is a God, is knowledge about God possible? Or is God, if there is a God, so transcendent that we really can't know anything of this God? So for Aristotle, his God was the prime mover, and you really could not know anything of the prime mover. Amongst the religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, for Islam, God or Allah is so transcendent that it's not proper or right, it's disrespectful to speak in terms of the attributes of God. But there are the 99 names of God that you can call God by, but you're not supposed to put God into categories of his attributes because that is beneath God's glory in the Muslim system. So is knowledge about God possible? Yes, but in that setting, not in a kind of a categorical way where you would reduce God down to a science that you would study. Is the scientific method the most reliable way to identify what is real? Well, obviously, there's going to be a big spectrum of people's thoughts with regard to that. Some people are going to be distrustful of the sciences. Other people are going to be involved not in being scientific, but in scientism, so that nothing is real to them unless it is given to them through the lens of science. Then when we get into God, the idea of God, Is God personal or impersonal? So is God more like a force, like a cosmic force, or does this being have personality as we find ourselves having? Is there one God or are there many gods? This is monotheism versus polytheism, but it's also monotheism versus pantheism. Is everything God? Is the world alive? Is the Gaia hypothesis true? Is our planet actually a living organism of some sort that has being? And thinking of that in terms of deity. Is God immanent or is God transcendent? Tennyson wrote of God as being closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. But then there's other views of God where God is so transcendent that there's really not much we can know about God. So these are other views. What are his or her or its attributes? Is God, a construct of the human mind? Are we God's creators? Or does God exist and have actual ontological essence, existence, and have attributes that we could catalog and discuss? Immortality, omnipotence, omniscience, to know everything, those kinds of things. Then in dealing with ultimate reality, or metaphysics, what I have said to students in the past is, if life is a jigsaw puzzle, metaphysics is the picture on the outside of the box. And so we're dealing with metaphysics, we're dealing with the issue of ultimate reality. So if there is a God, in terms of metaphysics, what's the relationship between God and the universe? I'm not going to unpack that. Is the existence of the universe a brute fact? Has the universe always been here? Prior to Einsteinian theory in the world of physics, there was a theory that postulated what's called the steady state. It's a steady state theory of the universe, and things basically always went on as they had been before. And Aristotle has postulated that matter is co-eternal with his prime mover. So is the existence of the universe a brute fact, or did it suddenly come into being somehow? The Big Bang kind of postulates the latter of the two. Is the universe eternal? In terms of the sciences, most people would say no. It had a beginning and it looks like it will have an end. And the most popular theory presently in astronomy and physics is that it will die a heat death as it gets further and further apart. The minority view is that there's going to be something called the Big Crunch, where it will then collapse in upon itself after it expands out to a certain point. But is it eternal? No, but we're talking about so many billions of years that it might as well be relative to our own lives. That's in the sciences. Is the universe eternal? Does the universe have a purpose, or is it chaotic? So when we talk about the Big Bang, it's this explosion in which everything from which ultimately we would get carbon-based life comes into existence. When we talk about a Big Bang, that sounds kind of random. Is it purposeful or is it chaotic? That's a legitimate question. Is it ultimately material in nature, or is it spiritual in some sense? So is the universe just matter plus time and chance and energy? Is that all that it is? Or is there something that doesn't fit into those categories, something that is spiritual involved in the universe? In the world of ethics, why is an action either right or wrong? I mean, this is what this course is about. Are there basic unwritten laws that everyone knows deep inside of themselves? We get into Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. next week. We will be looking at his view of natural law. He thinks that you have law written within you. Is morality objective, more like science or math, or is it subjective, more like art or fashion? Does morality change with cultures and peoples so that something could be truly wrong in one age and people group and truly right in another? What's a good person? What constitutes being a good person? What things are morally praiseworthy? What constitutes a good life? I mean, this is Socrates and Plato's concern. What would a good society look like? This is especially Plato's Republic that discusses this in the foundations of philosophy and ethics. What would a good society look like? To what degree do moral values exist apart from the religious notion of revelation? Is there such a thing as objective moral values, OMVs, as some people have spoken of them? Or is that something that has to be underwritten from a religious direction? Why be moral? If all of nature is red in tooth and claw, that's again Tennyson who says that, and if it is the survival of the fittest, why ought I to be moral to you? Why shouldn't I just be predatory? Then when we deal with human beings, Are we animals? Well, obviously we're mammals. We give live birth. We're warm-blooded. We nurse our infants. Yes, we're animals. Are we gods? Some would say yes, some would say no. There's varying views of this. Or somehow are we made in the image of the gods? If we are special, why are we special? Is it just our intellect and our ability to communicate, or is there something that is hard for us to put our fingers on that makes us special? What makes us different from other animals? Just how smart we are? Is that all that it is relative to them? And the fact that we have opposing thumbs? Or is there something else? Are we free, or are we actually pawns of fate or instincts? That was part of this week's reading. We're dealing with free will versus determinism and compatibilism. Are we free, or are we actually pawns of fate or instinct? Are we only bodies with brains, or do we have minds and hearts and spirits? And does physical death completely end the existence of a person? As we get especially into human beings and address them, this is one of the major places where we have conflicts of worldview, where if you have a different worldview from me, that we are going to have potential clash. Beyond God and epistemology and ultimate reality, those kinds of things, really when we get into human beings is when we start to get in the areas where there's a lot of a rub between myself, yourself, and somebody from a very different worldview from you. Going on with humans, are humans basically good or basically bad? So, when if we deal with philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought that we are basically good, we are the noble savage. The only thing that makes humans bad is basically human society. It messes up this noble savage. Whereas the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, in his poem Leviathan, says the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And Jean-Paul Sartre, the 20th century existentialist, says of human beings that man is a useless passion and hell is other people. Are we basically good or are we basically bad? Are we morally good, morally neutral, or morally bad? So Plato and Socrates basically think that we're morally good, and Aristotle, I think, thinks we're morally neutral because we need to be habituated in virtue. We don't come by the virtues naturally. Are we ontologically good or ontologically bad? So Christians, for instance, believe in the idea of original sin, or that human beings have a bentness to them, that they are turned in upon themselves, they're very selfish, and that they do wrong things. And so that there's something as to the essence of human beings that isn't as it should be. But oddly, Christians don't say, when a baby's born, oh, here comes another sinner. They celebrate just like other people do. Are we ontologically good or ontologically bad? What about the family? So a character who was on TV in the 1990s, played by Candice Bergen, whose name was Murphy Brown, said a family is whatever we say a family is. And today in academia anyway, we have people proposing the idea of thruples, or even more, a thruple would be a group of 3 who are the parents who are raising children in the home, or even more, 4 or 5 being put forward. So your worldview is going to affect this, and people from one worldview versus another worldview are going to be shocked and astonished when they encounter different definitions of the family from that with which they're familiar. So what about the family? Worldview determines this as well. Then we get into possible worldview relationships. So all the way over on the left, I've been married to my wife for 4+ decades. Well, probably our worldview looks a lot like that one all the way over on the left. I have a number of friends who come from very different backgrounds than myself, but we share enough in common as far as our worldview that I have, for instance, a liberal Jewish friend who is, and I'm a conservative Protestant man, but we hold enough in common that these overlapping rings, we'd have all that in common that overlaps in the middle that we share. Whereas, if you look all the way over to the right, when we see these two that have no overlap, there's a book that I use for this course called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. It's not got anything to do with religion. It has to do with a view of things from the Hmong peoples. The Hmong are a tribal group that came to the United States by way of Cambodia and Vietnam during the Vietnamese War and its aftermath. And they have very, very different views. They've never been assimilated by any culture, not by the Chinese or any other culture that they've lived amongst. They have their own views of reality. And the whole book is about the clash between the doctors that are trying to care for this child who was born with epilepsy, Neil Ernst and Peggy Phillips, and their family, the family of the child, because their views are so very different from the doctors. And it wears the doctors down that they're so different. Then there's the philosophy of naturalism or materialism. This doesn't have anything to do with John Muir or James Audubon. This is the idea that nature with a capital N, the natural world, is a closed system. So this is the view oftentimes put forward in the past by Carl Sagan and today by Neil deGrasse Tyson, that the cosmos is all there is, was, or ever shall be. That's a worldview. That's a view that says nothing but those things that are material and energy-based. It exists. Then there's nihilism, which we've already looked at, which basically says there's no picture on the box. Nihilism says that life is meaningless, so there really isn't a metaphysical definition to life because life has no ultimate purpose. So what one can do with a worldview when you're trying to understand somebody else's worldview is kind of take it out for a test drive. That's my terminology. And testing a worldview, this comes from my professor, Dr. Nash. He says there's the test of reason, the test of experience of both the outer and the inner world, and the test of practice. So when we're testing it as far as a test of reason, the law of non-contradiction, is this worldview contradictory? You can't really believe something that's contradictory if it contradicts itself. That's a nonsense worldview. Does it correspond then, when it's the test of experience, does it correspond to your experience of the outer world, of the world as you live in it and experience it? And does it correspond to your experience of your inner world? Does it feel comfortable with that too? Could you harmonize this? Could you understand what it feels like to be somebody in this worldview? And then can you live this worldview out? Okay, so those are the tests. And this is Atticus Finch, the famous character from To Kill a Mockingbird. He says you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. And that's really what the idea of studying worldview is all about. We would study worldview so we'd be able to understand where other people are coming from and be able to empathize with them. Doesn't mean that you have to embrace their worldview, but it means that you respect and understand their worldview and do your best to put yourself in their shoes.